Welcome back to a special episode, a really special episode of This Week in College Viability. Hi, everybody. Gary Stocker back behind the Blue Yeti microphone, talking higher education, but today a little bit different topic. We normally poke the higher education bear, but one of the topics that is increasingly important, and that's probably understating it, is college athletics, and so much going on with that. And my guest today is Greg Chick, who founded NILnomics, that's NILnomics, about a year ago. Greg, thanks for making time to join us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Gary.
And if you would, just quickly tell us about yourself.
Sure. So I am a recent PhD graduate from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Spent 10 years working on a study using advanced cutting-edge quantitative econometric methodology to study NCAA policy. So my expertise is on NCAA finances, and the consequences of it. And I write a newsletter where I continue the research, the analysis, and try to help people understand the world of college sports finances.
Yeah, and I got to say, if there's a top 10 topic in the world today, it's got to be college athletics. And you run NILnomics. I'm going to have to work hard on that. You run NILnomics with a commitment to something called radical transparency. And this is just in sports data. Why is college sports financial data so notoriously difficult for both journalists and fans to get a straight answer on, Greg?
Well, for the same reason why every NFL team doesn't let journalists see their books, right? Like, these are billion-dollar franchises that have no interest in letting people scrutinize how they're being operated. But fortunately or unfortunately for them, many of them are public institutions. So there is currently a system through the NCAA and other higher ed regulations where they have to report certain data to those organizations. And so both through them and public records requests, writers, researchers, journalists can receive copies of lots of documentation, a surprising amount of documentation of these athletic departments. And it's a bear. I have personally messaged every D1, D2 institution for their annual financial disclosures. And it's not easy. Some states require that you be a resident of the state.
Whoa.
Some of them will give you excessive costs. They'll make you pay like $1 a page, which doesn't sound much, but when it's a 90-page document or a 400-page contract with their MMR partner, it can add up pretty quickly. So these are major $1 billion companies that don't want people looking over their shoulder. They don't want financial scrutiny. They just want Congress or really the public to just buy into whatever they're demanding at the moment.
And clearly we have not one data nerd on this podcast. We have two, right? and it's a terrible disease. And Greg, I don't think there's any cure for it, at least in my mind. I don't think there's any pharmaceutical I can take to cure my interest in data and looking at it and providing perspective. And when you look at the data sets, and you just talked about a couple of those, when you look at the data sets you analyze, I guess from coaching contracts to even conference realignment, what, in your experience, in your expertise, what is the single biggest misconception that the general public has about where college sports money actually goes?
Well, I'm in the weeds on college sports, so I'm trying to put myself in the mindset of someone who just turns on the news. And as we're recording, the college sports machine is testifying in front of Congress. And if you listen to them, they would tell you that having to pay players is absolutely the worst thing to ever happen to college sports. Now, I've looked at their financial disclosures, and it just so happens that a significant amount of their budgets are going to pay coaches, their assistant coaches, the whole administrative state. That's where a majority of the money is going to. And I've got right in front of me here, Ohio State's FY25 report. Now, Ohio State reported $320 million last year. This is FY25, so that's the 24-25 season. Right. We're always a year behind.
Right.
But they've reported $320 million in expenses. Now, $54 million of that, or 17%, went to their coaches. And another 51 million, or 16%, goes to their support staff. So that's, 32% of their budget is going to pay for staff. And if that sounds right to people listening, um, great. But I think one would expect that labor, the people that are actually doing the work that's generating the hundreds of $1 million to a school like Ohio State, I think people would expect that the players get a certain cut of that.
Yeah.
Now, certainly they do right now, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
scholarships are a significant cost to the departments. Ohio State paid $25 million, or 8% of their budget, to pay for student aid and meals. People would be surprised to know Ohio State paid $7 million in FY25, or 2% of their budget, just to feed all those players. So certainly, this is before house settlement was a thing, where the $20 million cap is a real expense to these athletic
Yeah.
departments. But
Yeah.
I think a reasonable person listening to this would expect that labor should get their fair share of the revenue. And granted, it's if you listen to the leaders in this industry, they're saying the cost just came out of the sky, and they how could they have known or planned for it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is a joke. But again, back to your question, I think people don't recognize how much the administrators, the coaches, have made massive fortunes for themselves in this industry.
Let's talk then, for the most part, the conversation is about the Power Four. See if I can name them: the Big Ten, SEC, ACC, and Big 12, right? Are the Power Four conferences. So when we look outside of those, what happens to the Group of Five, which is the next set of conferences below that, and even the FCS schools, those even call it third-tier colleges, who are trying to survive in this financial ecosystem? Is this wealth gap becoming insurmountable for them, or is it already insurmountable?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's already challenging for many institutions. I've got the revenue expenses for all these schools, and many of them are in the red deeply. A lot of the group of six schools are operating at massive losses. They would not be able to operate if they weren't subsidized by student fees, by institutional, state, or even federal subsidies. So these programs are not profit generating by and large, not even just the group of six, but even at the Power Four level. Many of these programs are loss leaders for these institutions. But what you would hear from them, from the leaders, is they would say that this is their marketing expense for the institution. This is the front porch. This is how schools get their names in front of students and parents to market themselves. Now, is it sustainable? I heard a quote from the Kent State president about the cost of attendance stipend that went into place in 2015. That was the topic of my dissertation. He said, out of nowhere, Kent State suddenly had to pay $2 million a year. And that's a big part of Kent State's budget. They don't have a large, a $320 million operating budget. And now Kent State, a Bowling Green, is dealing with a $20 million expense. The reality is they're just not going to be able to afford it. And they can decry that and suggest that we're suddenly in a world of haves and have-nots. But, I was here 5 years ago. I would have characterized that world as a haves and have-nots. I think one of the big misconceptions is that something's changed, right? It's just now that the players are getting paid out in the open, we can all understand what's happening, instead of having to deny that that type of thing is going on.
So let's step back for a second and go back. We'll talk a little bit about parents and youth sports in the context. And a little bit later today, I'll record my weekly youth sports show with Joe Karabi. He and I talk about youth sports each week. And this podcast this week in College Viability was recently number 3 in podcasts for parents and college students, parents of college students. And so for the high school athlete and their family, who has either an extremely talented athlete in whatever sport, or less so, less physically gifted, less, whatever you want to characterize. And they're looking at the college brochure today for a college they want to go about, they want to think about going to. They'll look at the college majors and financial health and tuition and all that kind of stuff. How should they use athletic financial data to protect themselves from choosing a college for their child that might not be able to offer that sport or even stay in existence for the next 4 years?
Sure. I think just like youth sports, you hear a lot about how private equity is taking over, or that the costs for parents are getting out of control. From the higher education perspective, what I think of the most with this question is how athletics is being used at many institutions as an enrollment driver.
Oh yeah, yeah,
I think that the number one thing parents can do if they have a young athlete that's interested at an institution is, quite frankly, ask how long the program's been around.
yeah.
After Hampshire College just closed here in Massachusetts recently, we're seeing a lot of closures and mergers. I know that's the big focus of your work, Gary. One of the kind of low hanging fruit that many institutions are employing to drive increased enrollment is athletics.
Yep.
Now, just put yourself in the college president's, board of trustees, athletic director's shoes. They're looking for low cost sports that, given their market, they can drive revenue by just paying for as little expenses, whether it's coaches, support staff, and not offering full scholarships. If your child is being offered a spot at a team that's not offering a scholarship or a full scholarship, that's a red flag that the school, you know, it's a two-edged sword. Like I would hope that there's a genuine opportunity there and that things would go well, but the school could be just looking at the parent as a revenue generator just because they can offer a sport. So a lot of the data in the work I do is at the kind of top of the hierarchy in college athletics,
Right.
but I certainly have data on some of the bottom D2, D3 schools, and we're seeing athletics as kind of one of those early decisions that administrators are using to drive enrollment.
And it's kind of would you agree with this? It's kind of a pay to play system.
Yeah, certainly at the bottom tier, and I think you hear a lot of. I think we're going to get into this, the forecasting of the non-revenue sports, the Olympic sports, women's sports. Where that may go. That may be a reality too. The D1, the full D1 scholarship for those sports may be a thing of the past, possibly.
Yeah, I wondered about that. So, all right, let's go to the mountaintop. And we're going to hand you, Greg, we're going to hand you the keys to the NCAA tomorrow. And you're going to be told to fix the financial model for long-term institutional stability. I just want one. What's the very first policy change, now that you're king of the NCAA for a day, what's the one policy change you would implement?
The way I see it, college athletics has three options. They can either get an antitrust exemption from Congress, which they're trying to do right now as we talk.
Right.
They can collectively bargain with the athletes, or we can just live in this chaos. I think people always discount this third option, that we can live in this world where litigation will dictate the system's structure, rules, and policy. Unfortunately, I wish I that's a great question. How could I wave my wand? I mean, certainly I'm not sympathetic to the NCAA and the administrators who want to restrict student athlete rights and compensation. So I'm certainly against that. I'm not thoroughly convinced that collective bargaining may be in the players' interest, but I do think there's enough there that I wish we could get enough representatives of the top revenue generating sports athletes in a room and see, if they got the information, had a unbiased perspective, if they'd really want to bargain with the institution. I think there's enough in there for them. In some ways, you can look at the current state of college athletics as everything being in the athlete's favor. They have unlimited transfers. They have unlimited transfers. They're getting paid revenue share. There's NIL opportunities. We all know there's real NIL and then there's fake NIL. And I think the top players are certainly benefiting from that. But, there's a lot of benefits if they were to collectively bargain. We hear about how they're expanding the NCAA tournament. They're expanding the college football playoff. There's no union to represent the players' interest. Do you think the NFL adds another game to the schedule without having to give a slice to the players? That's certainly in their benefit. I mean, their practice schedule, the game schedule. We're hearing Arkansas or South Carolina complain about their schedule that just came out. The players could have a seat at the table with those decisions. So there's so much to be gained, I think, for collective bargaining. I think, I'm somewhat dodging your question, Gary, but I think if I had a magic wand that is, I would at least get the right players in the room, inform them as I'm trying to quickly inform your audience, and see if they also agree that collective bargaining is in their benefit.
Yeah, and I think a big picture perspective here is sports is a monstrous part of our culture, of our American culture, from when children are young, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, whatever it is, and across multiple sports, it's a big, big, big deal. Initially recreational, but as you mentioned, I think a couple minutes ago, it's becoming more corporatized. That's a word. For youth sports, especially for those who have some talent. Yet, I think the stats are something like only 2% of all high school athletes move on to college sports, some small number, but still it's a big cultural piece of what we do. And it's not going away. And chaos may be what it ends up being. But I'm writing you down for collective bargaining as your magic wand. Is that all right?
Sure. Yeah. I don't mind being labeled the collective bargaining fairy.
So Arkansas, University of Arkansas, recently dropped men's tennis and then, because of public pressure, added it back in. And there was some complicated financial math associated with this. In your opinion, in your experience, do you think this will be an isolated incident? Or is this kind of the first drop in a massive wave of Olympic sports being cut because of costs?
Yeah, funny you bring it up. That was one of the topics of one of my newsletters. I really dove into the economics of Arkansas athletic department, and I would just sum it up by saying, that the tennis program, it was about 1 or 2% of their budget. Certainly expenses are going up for these departments, but cutting the tennis program was not something that they had to do. If you were a cynical person, you might think that they did this to garner coverage and draw the donations that endowed a fund to pay for the team. But I'll take your question at face value, Gary. Yeah, I mean, we hear this a lot. We hear that paying players is going to drive cuts to other sports, and we're going to see all these Olympics non-revenue women's sports get cut. I'm skeptical. I certainly think you can't deny that it's going to happen, but at a massive scale, I'm not a believer in it. I think it's too embedded in the culture. As you said, sports is a part of American culture. The college system has served this country for over 100 years. I think there's just too much passion there. I think that's what's driving a lot of political action. People don't want to see these sports cut. I think it's what gives us our edge internationally and at the Olympic level.
Right.
So I don't think we're going to see massive cuts to programs. I do think we're going to see some. This is all just a wonderful opportunity for athletic directors to cut the programs they've never liked anyways, right? and just wave their hands. There's not. What else can we do? We're athletic directors. We're paying coaches $50 million to not coach, and we're buying ice factories for our athletes to recover in, and waterfalls, lazy rivers in their locker rooms. So we can't afford a mild wrestling program. It's a good excuse for athletic directors to cut programs, but I don't think it's going to be widespread.
Interesting. So you mentioned earlier on in the show that as we speak, there is activity in Washington, D.C. So here's the blunt question of the show, Greg. Will Congress give the NCAA the antitrust protection it wants?
I don't think so. What's funny about what's going on now with this Cruz and Cantwell compromise that's in front of Congress right now, that's being discussed as we speak, is the people that have come out against it, interestingly, is the SEC and Big Ten. They're the ones that are standing at the edge of the precipice, pushing against this, when it's been them driving this the last 5, 10, 20 years. If you don't know, the latest proposal seeks to pool media rights, which is to say, they, just like all the other professional leagues that we're all familiar with, the NFL, Major League Baseball, NHL, NBA, instead of letting conferences battle it out for television rights, pooling media rights would allow all D1 schools to sell their media rights to all these different broadcasters. But that would likely cause a cut in how much each of those Big Ten SEC schools get. And of course, they don't want that. So now the funny thing is when you ask Congress for help, you ask the government, the tax man to help you, they're going to help you in the way they want. And I think it was Matt Brown at Extra Points who said, those two conferences have pissed off a lot of people, excuse my language, along the way. There's no one in Big 12 country that wants to hear Texas, Oklahoma cry poor, or any of the other conference realignment where these what was once historically regional conferences have now just been torn apart, and we have these national conglomerations. So are they going to get a antitrust exemption? Not as it's built now. It's certainly a lot closer than it was with the SCORE Act, with this Cruz-Cantwell compromise, but it's not there yet. And you can see that they're giving ground more and more and more. Now, the big part of what differentiates the SCORE Act from this compromise is that employment is not mentioned in the legislation, which is a big conceit on the
Yeah.
Republican side.
Yeah.
So we're inching closer to something, but I just think now you've got these two power players in the Big Ten and SEC that are opposed. I don't see that getting rectified. I just think they're just going to keep spending money lobbying, and it's not going to go anywhere until they sit down with the players.
Going back to that collective bargaining kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, collective bargaining, yeah.
So let's take a second talk about your dissertation, because you looked backward with the work that you did on your dissertation to understand the present. What's the next major research project or even data blind spot you're looking at?
Oh man, I mean, if you're into data, like now is the time to be into college sports and college sports finances. It's like if you could pick a time since the beginning, like this would be the time, because there are so many policy changes. Like from a econometric policy perspective, it's just natural econometric experiments all over the place. My dissertation used a difference in difference methodology to understand the impact of a policy that allowed the top schools to award cost of attendance stipends, but which was only applicable at the D1 level. So you could see this difference between how D1 and D2 was impacted, and those type of effects and policies are happening all over the place, from NIL going into effect, now revenue sharing, transfer policy. So this is an econometrician's dream right now, and as well as just like I think there's a lot of interest in the money that's being driven by these institutions, by this industry. And now that labor has a seat, somewhat of a seat at the table, they're getting a bigger share of the pie. There's a lot more interest in how that's all going to play out. So what's next? I mean, everything. I've got in my pipeline looking at the athletic foundations. All these big programs have charitable foundations that drive donations and donate to the school. And funny thing, they're all public nonprofits, so you can look at their 990 returns and pull data to see how they operate and see how much they pay their CEOs and the people that run those organizations. I really love to talk about coach pay, athletic director pay, the people that run these nonprofit athletic department foundation pay, and now general manager pays. Now these really big schools all have general managers for their teams, and I assure you, they're not doing it for nothing. So, there's a lot of grown-ups who are very well paid in this industry, and now that the labor, the student athletes are getting a slice, it's the end of the world. So, I really like to highlight that in my work.
Interesting. So, one last question. I mean, that's the Gary scenario. So, we talked about this earlier, and let's assume a scenario where Power Fours start cutting non-revenue sports at a faster pace. Is it possible the Power Six and the FCS colleges will create those Olympic-type sports programs as enrollment and revenue incentives instead?
Yeah, so there's so many ways it could play out. Like, I guess if you accept your idea that all the Power Four schools are going to cut those programs, where do they go? I think it makes sense. Yeah, the group of 6 schools would scoop up all those elite players and try to drive attention and revenue for themselves that way. What? Even if I was I don't think that's realistic, but I do think what could happen is you're going to get schools that specialize. A lot of the schools could cut volleyball, but I don't see Nebraska ever cut in volleyball because they just filled a 100 seat stadium with their women's volleyball team. Right. I think you're going to get specialization. I just can't see Oregon cutting their track and field program. They're very well known for developing elite Olympic athletes, and it's a big part of Nike and what they're doing over there. So I could see a lot of schools cutting track and field, but you're going to get specialization at these different schools. And I think if massive cuts happen, that's the reality that will happen. You're going to see there's already been massive cuts to hockey traditionally. So I think the schools that have survived are going to stay with ice hockey. In fact, you see schools like Penn State add in ice hockey as from a club to a D1 program. That's an interesting story in itself. But I think you're going to see schools specialize. You know, is it wrestling? Is it lacrosse? Is it field hockey? Like school, that if the worst case scenario is that happening, but to take your case, yeah, I think there is an opportunity for those lower tier group of six schools to also, pick up athletes, because ultimately, any program cut has a trickle down effect of where those elite athletes go. So there is opportunity if schools want to make a name for themselves. If suddenly there's less volleyball programs and Nebraska's and a few other programs are the only dogs in town, there's opportunity there to really to stand out. So it could be interesting what the trickle down effects of that could be.
Interesting. Well, my guest has been Greg Chick, who is the founder of NILnomics, NILnomics, of course. NIL stands for name, image, and likeness. And Greg, some fascinating observations on this. Appreciate you taking time to join me on the program. And for those who have questions about what Greg talked about today, Greg, how can they reach out to you?
Oh, thanks, Gary. You can go to my website, www.nilnomics.com. On Twitter, on LinkedIn, those are my social medias of choice, my poisons, I suppose. But yeah, the newsletter is free. Would love to have you join and follow along with my research and analysis.
Greg, appreciate it. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Gary.